Okay, then we will start. I will welcome you all to this seminar entitled Evolution Union, Differentiation in European Integration. My name is Pernille Diker. I am a research professor here at NUPI and responsible for NUPI's Center for European Studies. Before I introduce the speaker today, I would just inform you a little bit about the background for this seminar. The topic of differentiation is chosen for two main reasons. First of all, because it is topical. Even though it has been the key question of the integration process since the beginning, there is little doubt that the different crises that the EU is currently faced with, and Brexit in particular, makes this even more urgent. But if we are moving towards more differentiation or multi-speed or flexible Europe, we need to understand better what this means for the EU, but also for associated members like Norway, and soon also probably the UK. The second reason is that it marks the start of a new research project that NUPI Center for European Study will be working on over the coming 3 years. We have called this project EUFLEX, and the aim of this project is to study how different levels of government in the EU institutions, member states and associated non-members cope with the need to find the right balance between an increasing demand for national autonomy and the need for more integration to be able to handle a set of common challenges. Well, this project have a special focus on how differentiated integration plays out in the area of foreign security and defense policy. Today's seminar will have a somewhat broader focus. In the current situation, it is likely that we will see a process of more differentiation in European integration, but the question is what this means. What is differentiated integration and how has it developed? And what are its conditions and mechanisms? And finally, will it be helpful to overcome some of the challenges and crises that the EU is facing? If so, how? And if not, why not? We are very fortunate to have Professor Frank Schimmelpfennig here today to address some of these questions. Frank is Professor of European Politics and member of the Center for Cooperative and International Studies at the ETH Zurich. And he has written extensively on this issue recently. He has also written several interesting pieces on the theory of European integration in general, and more specifically on EU enlargement, democracy promotion, and democratization, in addition to the topic of today. So Frank, we really look forward to listening to you, you will talk about 40 minutes, and then we will open the floor for a Q&A. So the floor is yours. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Pernille, and of course thanks to all of you for coming here. I think Pernille has already set the right tone for this, which means it's that differentiated integration has become an important topic in the current reform debate in the European Union. You also said that differentiated integration has been with us for a very long time, but it's probably fair to say that in the past, differentiated integration has been much more of an accident. Yeah? So, I mean, the European project has always focused on uniform integration as its goal, yeah? But then, due to some failed referendums, you had to find a way out of failed negotiations. Differentiated integration was used basically as a quick fix. It was never a strategic goal to organize European integration as differentiated. Now that has certainly changed. Now it is one of the explicit reform options that European politicians are debating at the moment. And I've just given you some views. You know, of course, that it has been one reform option in the white paper of the European Commission. Probably the French president has been the most clearly outspoken proponent of a differentiated way forward for European integration. Angela Merkel has, at least verbally supported him, but Germany has always taken a much more cautious approach to that, rather seeing its role as keeping the Union together, mediating between the different parts of the Union. Even though the European Commission has proposed differentiated integration as one reform option in its white paper, it is actually quite skeptical about it. It's not something that is very high on the wish list of the European Commission for the future of the European Union, and that has also become clear in a State of the Union speech that Juncker, I think, delivered 2 years ago, where he said, well, a more united Union also needs to become more inclusive. And of course, there are quite a few member states that also fear differentiated integration as a mechanism that would leave them behind, turn them into second-class member states of the European Union. That's a view you often hear in Central and Eastern Europe, and the Polish President Andrzej Duda has been very explicit about this, saying that basically differentiated integration would be the beginning of the end of the Union. So, I mean, it's very nice for a researcher like me that this is now debated and is actually a policy option that we have studied a lot in the past, but which has not really been very prominent in the reform debate. But on the other hand, I think it is also our role as academics, researchers, to introduce some evidence into this debate and to see whether, let's say, the hopes and the fears connected to the idea of differentiated integration are warranted, and how it has developed in the past, what we can learn from differentiated integration as it has been practiced so far. So I will try to raise and also at least partially answer 4 questions. First, what is different? Let it sit there. Oh yeah, it sounds different. Yeah, sorry about this. Where was I? So, I mean, the second question is, why do we have differentiated integration? What are the drivers? What are the constraints of differentiated integration? Then more empirically, how has it developed in the past? Yeah, what are the big trends in differentiated integration? And then, of course, I will finish with the more policy-oriented question whether it's actually a good thing or a bad thing for European integration. Okay, so what do we mean by differentiated integration? And now I'm speaking about the way that we have used it in our research. We've tried to use a concept of differentiated integration that is rather minimalist, that is really trying to set differentiated integration apart from other things in order to be able to really nail it down, because otherwise it gets a bit fluffy. And we use it as a legal concept. So in our definition, differentiated integration refers to the differential validity of EU legal rules codified in treaties and legislation. Yeah? So we look at formal differentiation, codified in legal rules. It could be primary law, treaties, could be secondary law, EU legislation, yeah, but clearly we look at the texts of legal acts to see whether they exempt member states from the validity of these rules, yeah, or maybe also exclude member states from the benefits of certain policies. Yeah. Second, we distinguish between internal and external differentiation. So that's something that you in Norway are, of course, very familiar with. On the one hand, you can have the selective non-participation of member states, yeah, in some of the EU's rules and policies, but you can also have the selective participation of non-member states, which is what we then call external differentiation. So again, like in the EEA, you have European Union rules, but in some cases, in some policy areas, they also apply to non-member states that have selectively signed up to these rules without being members of the European Union. So in previous work, together with Bertolt Rittberger and Dirk Leuven, we've made a distinction between horizontal differentiation, which is what I've just talked about, and vertical differentiation, which I exclude from my talk today. Vertical differentiation means the differential centralization of European integration across policy areas. Yeah? So here we're just looking across countries. Yeah? And of course, there are many other ways in which the European Union can introduce flexibility. Yeah? Flexible integration is probably the bigger term, yeah? Which encompasses a lot of other things too. One is, of course, that EU rules can have a variety, can have various means of legal discretion. Yeah? So if you think of minimum harmonization, which gives member states some leeway in how they want to implement European Union rules. Yeah? They all have to comply with the minimal standards, but they can go beyond it. That introduces flexibility. Of course, implementation also introduces flexibility. If you think of the standard EU directive, it sets a goal, sets a target, but it leaves it open to member states how they want to implement that to reach this target. That again introduces flexibility. And there's of course a very practical form of flexibility that member states have, which is non-compliance, yeah, with EU rules, yeah, which some of the member states also practice to a very large extent. And then you can also have, let's say, informal cooperation between member states. Yeah, think of the new Hanseatic League, yeah, that has come up. Think of the Visegrad Group. Think of the traditional German Franco engine. Yeah. These are all informal subsets of member states that cooperate to some extent, but it's informal, and for that reason does not fit our definition of formal legal differentiation. Yeah, but it's just to point out when we think of a flexibilization of European flexibility. Now, why do we have differentiated integration? And there's a very broad consensus in the literature on this topic that the basic reason for having differentiated integration is to cope with heterogeneity. With the growing heterogeneity that we find among the member states or in the European region more broadly defined. Now, this heterogeneity between states can be a heterogeneity in preferences. Member states have very different ideas about where European integration should go, where it should end, what it should do. Yeah? But it could also be differentiation in capacity. Yeah? So even if they have the same goals, they might not all be able, yeah, to implement these policies, yeah, in an effective way. Yeah? So
some countries might just not have the capacity, yeah, to participate in some of EU policies, even if they share the goals of integration. Now, of course, heterogeneity as such is not a sufficient reason for not having uniform integration. I mean, there are other means of dealing with it. You can have policy packages, you can have side payments to deal with that. But of course, when heterogeneity becomes so large that it is ideological, yeah, that you have no overlap of preferences, or that capacities become so different, yeah, that in a system that is based on the unanimous consensus on policies, you will not find this consensus anymore. So in a system that only allows for uniform integration or no integration at all, you will very likely come up with no integration at all if you don't allow for differentiation. Differentiation under these conditions gives you the opportunity to say, okay, maybe we will not be able to cooperate with everyone, yeah, but there will be groups, yeah, that share certain integration preferences or that have similar capacities, yeah. And even if not everyone's on board, these groups are able to cooperate and to integrate further. Now, of course, it is a truism, yeah, that European integration, or that the member states have become more heterogeneous over time. If you think of the EU6, yeah, with quite similar integration perspectives in the beginning, also similar levels of socioeconomic development, and you think of the EU 28, 27, 28 now, you can see, yeah, that in the course of deepening and widening, heterogeneity has grown enormously. Yeah? Member states have very different ideas about what European integration should be and should do, and of course the range between the richest and the poorest countries in the Union has expanded over time quite massively. So this creates more demand. Yeah? But of course, if it was just about demand, yeah, we would see much more differentiation than we actually see, because not every demand for differentiation can be realized. There are some conditions that need to be fulfilled before you can actually implement differentiation. One is, it's of course a matter of size. Yeah? So the size of the group that wants to move ahead has to be of some critical number of member states. Yeah? If you just have one or two member states, they will probably not be able to go ahead, because it would not be worth it. Yeah? So you have to find the sufficient number of member states to actually be able to introduce the policies that you want to introduce. There are benefits to size that you can only exploit, and of course with small groups you run into all kinds of transaction costs, yeah, that make the project not really worthwhile. So size is one issue. A second very important issue is externalities. Yeah? So once you begin to integrate in different groups, the issue comes up, okay, how does this differentiated integration impact, yeah, on these two groups? Now, if you have neatly separable groups where low-level integration and high-level integration don't interfere with each other, that's fine. Yeah? Everybody can basically go their own way without interfering with each other, without imposing costs. Yeah? But of course, as we know from economic analysis, once you have different levels of regulation, you will usually also have externalities, meaning that integration at one level has a positive or negative impact, yeah, on those countries that are integrated at a lower level. Now, when you have positive externalities, it means that those countries that are integrated at a higher level actually also produce benefits for those that are not part of this. So that's the whole discussion about cherry picking, yeah, or cakeism, which is a new word for something similar. Yeah, have your cake and eat it too. So when differentiated integration creates positive externalities, of course it creates an incentive for those countries that are more integrated to leave the scheme of high integration. Because I mean, why would you want to reduce your autonomy, have higher costs of integration if you can reap the same benefits outside? Yeah? So that has an impact. You can also have negative externalities, of course. If the group that integrates more than the others is actually able to impose some costs on those that are outside. Yeah? Now, if you have differentiated integration that creates high negative externalities, of course, it creates a very strong incentive for the outsiders to join in the end. Yeah. So if being outside, even if you would love to be outside to preserve your sovereignty or whatever, yeah, if the costs become too high, you unwillingly join in the end. Yeah? So once you have substantial externalities, be they positive or negative, they undermine differentiated integration, either because the insiders will leave the more integrated group or because the outsiders will be coerced, forced to join the insiders. And then, of course, there are different institutional contexts that also have an impact on how likely differentiated integration is and how it works. So what we find is that in those policy areas where you start with differentiated integration from the very beginning, it is also more likely that they will continue to develop in a differentiated way, which has to do with a number of factors. First, I mean, if you establish differentiated institutions, they will create path dependencies. If the insider group is only composed of willing and able states, they will be also more able to agree on further integration afterwards. There are a couple of reasons for that. The institutional context also explains the different bargaining power, yeah, that countries have in negotiations on differentiated integration. So, I mean, if you, as a general rule, we can say that differentiated integration benefits those countries whose preferences are closest to the status quo. Yeah? So, I mean, think of the UK, yeah, which has always been very reluctant to engage in further deepening. Yeah? When other countries want to deepen further, and if you need a consensus of our member states for treaty ratification, of course, those states that are less willing, yeah, to integrate further can say, okay, we will only allow you to move ahead if we get an opt-out, yeah, for instance. So, I mean, if you're close to the status quo, you can basically force those countries that are more willing to integrate to give you an opt-out, or you force them to conclude a new integration treaty outside the EU treaty framework, as it has been the case with Schengen or with the fiscal compact. It also means, however, and that's what we also see in the case of the UK, if a Eurosceptic country wants to disintegrate, yeah, it's the other countries that are the status quo powers, yeah, and they will enjoy more bargaining power, and that's what we've seen in the negotiations between the UK and the EU in the past 2 years. So we have the heterogeneity-driven demand for differentiated integration. But we can also say this demand can only be realized if you find a sufficiently sizable group, to move ahead with differentiated integration. Otherwise, it doesn't make much sense. You need to make sure that there are no fatal externalities. Otherwise, countries will not engage in differentiated integration. Think of the fate of the financial transaction tax in the European Union. And there has to be a favorable institutional context for this. Okay. What we found in our research is that there are actually two sets of drivers for differentiated integration in the EU. And we have what we call instrumental differentiation, which basically starts from the heterogeneity of economic preferences and capacities among the member states. So the divide between wealthy and poor states in the European Union. And this type of differentiation mainly comes up in the context of EU enlargement. So when the EU enlarges towards poorer member states, as it has done for the past 10, 15 years, the wealthier member states fear that enlargement will cause them economic harm, meaning either more low-wage competition, or more immigration that they would want to avoid, more payments, because poorer member states don't pay as much into the EU budget, so they fear about more transfers. For all of these reasons, they might like to veto the accession of poorer new member states. And of course, they have the bargaining power, because those countries that want to join the European Union usually have much less bargaining power than those that are already inside. So what happens is to arrive at a yes from these wealthy member states to enlargement, they exclude the new member states from some of the costly policies they would join, at least for some time. That's why you have, let's say, the phasing in of agricultural subsidies. This is why you have the 7-year period without the free movement of labor, and a couple of other things. Now, it is important to note that these are only temporary exceptions, or discriminations, as the new member states would say. Usually, it's for 7 or 10 years. It's not permanent. That would not be compatible with EU law to have it as a permanent exception. At least so far, that hasn't really happened. So this is one major driver. The other one is what we call constitutional differentiation, and here it's not the heterogeneity of economic preferences and capacities; it's the heterogeneity of ideological preferences about European integration. So, what do you see as the limits of integration? What's the end goal of European integration? And here, it's a mix. It's again wealth plays a role. So wealthier states in the European Union are usually more reluctant to give up national sovereignty, national autonomy, because they think they live rather well with a lot of national sovereignty, and don't think they need to give away a lot of that. But it's not just wealth; it's also Euroscepticism. So here you have a divide between integration-friendly states on the one hand and wealthy Eurosceptic member states on the other hand. Let's say, think of the other Nordics. Yeah? Norway fits in there too, of course. Yeah? So this type of divide, this type of heterogeneity plays out in the context of treaty revisions, which are about deepening, which are about giving more powers to the European Union and shifting power from the Council to the supranational organizations. And here it's again the wealthy Eurosceptic countries that have bargaining power, that can basically say, well, if you want to move ahead with monetary union, with Schengen, with defense and what have you, you can do that, but we will only let you do that if we get an opt-out, if we don't have to join in. So here, the typical thing you find is exemptions, opt-outs for Eurosceptic nationalist countries. And these differentiations tend to be durable. Think of for how long we've had differentiation in the Eurozone, in Schengen, with the UK, with Denmark. And it also tends to be dynamic. That means once you have a differentiation in a policy area, once you have differentiated integration, to make integration in a certain policy area feasible, this tends to proliferate. That is, every reform in this policy area will be differentiated too. Okay, so these are the main drivers, the main conditions. We can also make a distinction according to policy areas. This is mainly the internal market. This is mainly what's now called core state powers. Monetary union, fiscal policies, interior policies, defense. We can also see this in these graphs, which are based on an analysis of all European Union treaties and the differentiations we find there. So for treaty revisions, we see that we see here that as countries become wealthier, it's not a steep slope here, but it's still significant. The more the wealthier countries become, the more probable it is that they will get a differentiation in treaty negotiations. Also, the stronger their exclusive national identity is. That is, the more people say that we only see ourselves as Danes, Brits, French, or whatever. So the more exclusive the national identity is, also the higher the probability of getting an opt-out. Whereas for accession treaties, it's the other way around. Here you see the richer countries, the richer new member states are, the less differentiations they will have, and exclusive identity is flat, doesn't matter in this context. We can also see that beyond the member states. So here we look at governance quality based on the worldwide governance indicators, which are strongly correlated with wealth. So what you see here is that the better the governance quality and wealth of countries become, the more likely they are to join the core of the European Union. And those that are wealthier than the core tend to move out again. And as you can see, the country I work in is one of the outliers. Of course, it sees itself as the most democratic country in the world and as one of the wealthiest one, but still it should be closer to European integration if it was part of the pattern. Norway is only second when it comes to outliers. But so generally we see this curvilinear relationship. The wealthier countries become, the better their governance quality becomes, the more likely they are to move to the core of the European Union. But if they are wealthier than the core, and if they are better governed than the core, they are less likely to be part of this. So that's why we have these two spheres of European integration, let's say the refused and the refusers. So there has been some fear about differentiated integration being a slippery slope, yeah? Meaning that once you start with giving countries opt-outs, with giving countries exemptions, yeah, this will lead to a gradual unraveling of the entire integration project. Yeah, this is what our colleagues, the lawyers, like to fear, yeah, and like to warn about. But what's the actual record? Well, if you just look at the number of differentiations we find in EU treaties or in EU legislation, they seem to be right, yeah, because as you can see, okay, in the beginning, European integration has been largely uniform. There have been some peaks and dents related to the different enlargement rounds, but over and all, it has been a rather uniform process, yeah, until the early 2000s with Eastern enlargement and some other treaties. The number of differentiations that we find in the EU treaties has reached a new level, yeah? And it doesn't seem to go down again. Also, if you look at EU legislation, directives and regulations, you find that over time, yeah, the number of differentiations in these EU laws is increasing. But I would say this is a misleading picture. I mean, this is what you show when you want to scare people, yeah, but it's not the real thing. The real thing is, of course, that in the same period, the number of member states has multiplied. The number of policy areas covered by European integration has multiplied. And of course, you have to control for that. So when you control for the number of policy areas covered by European integration and the number of member states, what you see is actually a development with ups and downs, but the current level of differentiated integration being the same as at the very beginning when it all started with the treaties of Rome. And when you look at legislation, actually, what we've seen is an overall trend of reduction of differentiation in the legislation of the European Union. Yeah, so again, controlling for the numbers of law in force and the number of members, differentiated integration has actually decreased in a long trends over the decades. It has been much more pronounced at the very beginning of European integration. So we should, I mean, they say a realistic picture would actually look at these graphs and find that we do not see a trend towards ever closer union. With regard to legislation, it's the opposite, and with regard to treaties, we can actually say, well, it's more of a compensation mechanism. Yeah, the larger the EU becomes, the more policy areas it covers, the more heterogeneous it becomes, the more differentiation it will have. But this is mainly to compensate the increase in integration rather than a trend towards a more differentiated union. And what we also find is that differentiated integration is overwhelmingly multi-speed, which means that countries travel at different pace, but in the end reach the same destination. Yeah? So when we look at the 230 differentiations in EU treaties in our data set, we find that 2/3 of them had already expired by last year. The mean duration of a differentiation is something like 7 years, 5 months, so it's a reasonable time period, yeah, from beginning to end for these differentiation. It is, of course, more pronounced in the case of accession-based differentiations. They are shorter than those based on treaty revisions, and they also terminate much more than those based on treaty revisions. Yeah, so it's double the rate, and it's really the differentiations from treaty revisions that follow this logic of constitutional differentiation that that do not fit the multi-speed picture. Yeah, so all differentiations with a duration of more than 14 years are from the treaty revisions. None of them is from the enlargement treaties of the European Union. So enlargement-based differentiation is really just a pragmatic lubricant that makes it easier for new member states to join, but will not create permanent divisions. But there is this rest of multi-tier integration, which is this idea of core and peripheral Europe, where you have a stable core of member states and a stable periphery. Now, usually when you think of core periphery relationships, you think of you picture a pyramid, with a few top dogs, and a broad base of have-nots. This is not core. This is not what happens in differentiated European integration. It's rather a pyramid that stands on its top. So it's a highly inclusive core that's also very open, for countries to join. And those that are not in the core are not in the core because the core won't let them in. It's because they deliberatively stay outside, which is, of course, the case with UK and Denmark. So here, what you can see here broadly is 3 groups of member states. The core countries are those that now have 0 to 2 ongoing differentiations at the end of 2018. This is actually the largest number of member states. Then you have, of course, the periphery, which might look a little bit lonesome when the UK leaves for the Danes. And you have this, what you could call semi-periphery of countries with a medium number of ongoing differentiations. What you can see is that those countries that are now in the core have started at very different levels of initial differentiations. So countries like Lithuania and Latvia actually had as many differentiations as the UK and Denmark have now, but because of the inclusiveness of the core and their willingness to move into the core, they have done this in a period of 10 to 12 years. What really distinguishes these 3 groups is how they relate to the integration of core state powers. Now, this is what really drives this multi-tier structure. So those countries that have the euro, that participate in the area of freedom, security, and justice are those that are in the core. The intermediate countries do not have the euro. And these countries neither have the euro nor participate fully in the interior policies. So this really makes the distinction. It's how countries relate to the idea of integrating core state powers, of integrating what used to be called high politics. We also see that actually not only are these different groups rather stable, but they have recently also moved further apart. So if you look at this fat line here, it's the standard deviation of differentiations by country. So the higher up this is, the more distinct, the more apart are the core and the periphery of the European Union. And you can see that over a very long time, this has been fluctuating but remained at a very low level. But we see that since the mid-2000s, and that's a result both of Eastern enlargement and a result of the euro crisis, we've seen that the 2 groups are moving further apart. So those countries, of course, that are in the eurozone have been part of all the reforms that have increased integration with the banking union, the ESM, and so on, whereas those outside the eurozone have not followed these reforms, which has driven them further apart. So there is some, as I said before, in this constitutional differentiation, which is based on how willing you are to integrate in the area of core state powers, there is this dynamic path-dependent element, which actually drives the European Union apart in these areas and creates durable and growing differences within the European Union. This can also be seen in legislative differentiation. If you subdivide legislation according to these 4 areas, the market, expenditure policies like agriculture, regulation, and core state powers, we see that differentiation goes down for all of these policy areas except for the core state powers. Yeah? So this is an area where legislation also becomes more differentiated over time. Yeah? So again, this refers to fiscal policy, monetary policy. It refers to interior policies, yeah, asylum, and so on. So let me conclude with some thoughts about whether differentiation is actually good for European integration. And my baseline answer is yes. I think it's been a very good thing if you value European integration as such. Of course, if you don't like European integration, you might come to different conclusions. But my point is that differentiated integration has facilitated European integration tremendously over the past decades. European integration would not be where it is now without this instrument in introducing flexibility to accommodate different integration preferences and capacities. So as we've seen, the European Union has become more heterogeneous over time, which would have made widening and deepening much more difficult had it not been for the possibility of differentiated integration. Without differentiation, we can be quite sure that the European Union today would be much smaller. It would not be integrated as deeply as it is. It would probably be an internal market of wealthy countries. Yeah, it would not. We would not have seen Eastern enlargement, maybe not even Southern enlargement, at least not as quickly happening as we've seen it. Again, you might say, well, it would have been better for the European Union had it not created the euro and had it not integrated all of these poorer countries, which is a fair point. Yeah, but if you, as I said, if you start from the assumption, yeah, that you want more integration, you cannot have it without differentiation. And of course, as in the case of Norway, it also allows for the selective integration of non-member states. Yeah? For many non-member states, if the alternative was just between being fully outside or being a member, this would be a much harder choice than being able to flexibly integrate where you think it meets your preferences and your capabilities. We've also seen that most of the differentiations have actually been temporary. Yeah, so it's not a permanent it's not a permanent development of ever looser union. Yeah, but it's a most of differentiated integration is a temporary fix to overcome decision-making blockages, yeah, to make it easier for skeptical countries to either allow others to move ahead or to integrate countries they think are not really up to the necessities of European integration when they join. If you control for growth, the EU has not become more differentiated over time. I've also tried to show this. And even though it has this component of core Europe versus peripheral Europe, this has to be taken with a grain of salt because the core is actually much larger than the periphery. It has been open, has been very inclusive, and those countries that have not joined the core yet have not been discriminated, have not been preempted from joining the core, but were actually allowed to stay in the periphery. And it also depends on your idea of what normative model of European integration you have. If you think, well, the model for the European Union is not a unified federal democracy, but it's actually an association of multiple demoi, meaning statespeoples that want to remain different statespeoples, so to have a democracy. Differentiated integration is actually... Have a little bit of time? Yeah. Finally, of course, coming back to the reform debate I alluded to in the very beginning, the big question now, of course, is, well, is differentiated integration also a good way to overcome the current so-called polycrisis of the European Union? Yeah? Is it really an important and valid reform option to get out of the difficulties the European Union is in at the moment? Well, here I'm actually not so optimistic, and the main reasons are these two. So differentiated integration actually works best to kickstart integration, be it enlargement or the integration of new policies, rather than to consolidate already integrated policies. So it's great to overcome the initial hurdles towards further integration in the European Union. And there are, of course, areas which cannot be, or at least should not be, differentiated. And this is when it comes to the fundamental values and norms of the European Union. If you think of the European Union as a community of liberal democratic states, it becomes problematic if you allow differentiated integration to extend to these basic values of the European Union. Now let's look at the different crises to see whether differentiated integration would be a way out. Well, there have been proposals for a differentiated way out of the euro crisis. So Fritz Sharp, for instance, has proposed a two-tier Eurozone, mainly a break between the northern and the southern Eurozone. Now, had he made this proposal before the Eurozone was created, that would have been a very useful proposal. But once you have the Eurozone, with all the interdependencies that it has, with all the sunk costs that it has entailed, it is just too costly and too risky to break it apart now, and this is why this has also not happened during the Eurozone crisis. What you would need to consolidate and to fix the Eurozone would be something that differentiated integration does not deliver, which is solidarity among the member states, greater willingness to engage in mutualization or solidarity schemes to support the future survival of the Eurozone. So whenever you need more solidarity, more transfers to fix a policy, differentiated integration will not help you, because by definition, differentiated integration is the opposite of solidarity. And this is, again, something that also makes differentiated integration for the refugee crisis of limited value. Again, the issue is how to overcome the deficits of a policy that needs more solidarity among the member states, like a fair allocation of asylum seekers among the recipient countries. Of course, let's say the Eastern European countries would be extremely happy with differentiated integration. Let the others move ahead, with dealing with all the asylum seekers, and we will be out of it. It's exactly for that reason that the destination countries for refugees will not engage in differentiated integration of asylum policy because they do not want to let the others off the hook. Here we see a case where differentiated integration would result in cherry picking, positive externalities. Yeah, this is why the insiders do not have an interest in pursuing this path. Brexit also shows that differentiated integration becomes a lot harder once you move from integration to disintegration. So, as I already said, as long as the issue was about the UK not moving ahead with the others but getting opt-outs, it had the bargaining power to get them, and the other member states were actually quite willing to give the UK the opt-outs that it wanted. Once you move from integration to disintegration, as in the case of Brexit, those countries that want to exit do not have that same bargaining power anymore, because now they are the demandeur. They want others to make concessions, and it's also a very different situation for the rest of the EU. Yeah, it's much easier to give some states an opt-out when this enables the rest of the EU to move ahead with integration, and this compares with the situation that we have now, where one country wants to move out, and the rest of the EU wants to prevent others from following this country. So it will be the bargaining will be much harder in order to deter other countries from following the same path. This is why differentiated disintegration is so much more difficult than differentiated integration. Finally, and that refers to what I said in the beginning, differentiated integration is not a way to overcome the rule of law crisis that we have in the European Union. The rule of law is so important for the functioning of the entire union. The independence of judiciaries is part of the DNA of the internal market of the European Union. This is nothing you can compromise on, that you can differentiate. Yeah? So again, to overcome the conflict that the rest of the EU has with countries like Hungary, Romania, Poland, differentiated integration would not help, even though this is exactly what Hungary and Poland want. Yeah, they say this is our business; we can do it on our own. But this is not an option for the European Union, because the functioning of the European Union depends on the rule of law and independent judiciaries being active, functional in all of the member states. Okay, I thank you very much for listening to me, and hopefully the mix, let's say, of a rather optimistic look back on differentiated integration and the rather pessimistic look ahead for differentiated integration will give you enough stuff to debate and comment on.
Thank you so much, Frank. This was very interesting. Does this work, Christopher? No? Yes? No? No? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, this was very, very interesting, and it's also very useful for us who are now starting up a project on this topic. So to have these kind of different analytical categories. But the obvious question, of course, is how to solve this crisis, because I think that many thinks that differentiated integration is a solution to many of these crises, and it's inevitable that we will move in that direction when you have increasing Euroscepticism, and this is the only way to keep on. So that is my first question. Of course, I guess this is difficult to answer, but you can start maybe to to say something about that while I collect some questions from the audience.
Well, I mean, I would have a functional answer for how we overcome these crises, and the proposals are all on the table. It is just that member states are not able to find a consensus on these issues. Yeah, like let's say a further systems of fiscal transfers, or at least fiscal insurance policies in the Eurozone, yeah, or schemes for a fair distribution of asylum seekers in the Schengen area, or more harmonized asylum rules. I mean, the proposals are all on the table, and of course, I think it's a cognitive shortcut to say just because member states cannot agree on these issues, the way forward is differentiated integration, because this will not solve any of these issues. Yeah, I mean, if you, it may be a way to overcome the disagreement among the member states, but it will not solve any of the policy issues behind it. Yeah, so breaking up the Eurozone is no way to save it, of course, and finding differentiated integration in the EU's asylum and migration policies will only perpetuate the current situation in which you have an extremely unbalanced burden of the member states. So I don't have a solution. I'm just saying that differentiated integration is not the solution.
Mm-hmm. There might be people who will fear that you will have more demand for exits if you don't accommodate some of these concerns from the member states. So that's the one, so that you can this is the only way for the EU to survive, some will argue, I guess. But I see your point that you have this on the table already. It's just that I don't know. See, in some of these issues, it's very difficult to see how the member state will actually agree. In the refugee area, for instance.
Yeah, they will not, but they will also not differentiate.
No. Okay, we have a few questions already. Marianne first.
Thank you, and thank you, Sarah. Thank you for a great introduction and presentation. Very helpful for our project in many ways. I was wondering, I guess it's a follow-up on Linus' question in a sense, because you have been focusing on how differentiated integration allows the EU to move forward, because it helps the EU to deal with variation and heterogeneity. But I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the factors that kind of pull the other way, or the other direction, because there are many
Which other direction?
No, towards more unity, because there are many cases, or even much more cases, where the EU actually moves forward in spite of variation and heterogeneity. So what are the factors that kind of drive the EU towards unity instead of then? Yeah, I mean, you have these kind of factors that you say have to be present for the EU to differentiate, but it's really very broad, and many of the factors that you point to, the institutional factors, would actually kind of seem to point towards more stability and less differentiation. So if you could just say a bit more about that. And linked to that also, if then you're saying that some people say that crisis is driving more differentiation, which would seem to follow logically from your argument, since it's a functional response to diversity. But are you saying instead that crisis will kind of lead the EU towards more unity in a sense? But yeah.
Okay. So, of course, everything I said takes for granted that there are important drivers for further integration in the European Union. This is my starting point. The other starting point, however, is that it has been for the past 25 years. It has been generally not possible to realize this demand for more integration in a uniform way, because of the heterogeneity of the European Union, which always caused some member states to disagree with these integration projects, and made some of the proponents of more integration skeptical about everybody joining, because that's the other way. It's not just that some member states don't like to move ahead with European integration, it's also that those who would like to move ahead usually do not want to have everybody on board, because they think they don't have the capacity, or they're not reliable, they're not credible, and so on. So I'm not talking about what makes the European Union move ahead with integration. I focus on what makes this move towards further integration possible. And differentiated integration has been the answer. It has made this possible. I mean, otherwise we can start with the very standard explanations, which have to do with globalization, interdependence, all kinds of functional reasons. But in a heterogeneous union, these interdependencies and functional reasons are usually not sufficient to allow for further integration. They create demand, but the heterogeneity that we also have has the impact that it will only be possible if there is differentiation. And I think I lost the second part of your question.
Should I repeat?
Yeah, yes, please.
About crisis, 'cause it's
Oh, yeah.
chronologically that crisis
Mhm.
drive
I mean, that's
the argument.
that is a bit the basis of the reform discussion now. So, okay, we have this crisis. In order to overcome this crisis, we need differentiation. And here, as I said in the very end, I'm very skeptical about this. I think this is some kind of a cognitive shortcut that doesn't really hold up, because the reasons that we find in these crises have a lot to do with the malfunctioning of earlier integration arrangements, and they have to do with the rather minimal fair weather institutional arrangements that we have established in the Eurozone or in the Schengen area. So in order to fix this, differentiation is not the answer. Differentiation is a good answer to blockages in integration when you have no integration at the very beginning. Some want integration, some don't. Then you can fix it with differentiated integration. If you have integration already, if it doesn't work the way it should, or if it suffers from shocks, the best answer usually is not to rip this integration apart, but to fix these issues. This is why I'm very skeptical that differentiated integration is the best way forward to fix the crises that we have. Now, of course, there are some issues of crisis where this may fit. I mean, there are people. I mean, it's a counterfactual, but there are people that say, okay, had the EU allowed for more flexibility with regard to the freedom of movement of labor, we would not have seen the Brexit vote succeed. Yeah. Yes, maybe.
And just add one question to that. Would it mean that in the areas that you have full integration, well, you have full transfer of powers, in these areas, if you have a crisis in these areas, it's not possible to kind of have differentiated integration to solve the crisis. But maybe in the other policy areas, where you have some integration, but not full integration. For instance, in the area that we are studying, foreign security policy, then maybe it's the only way to move forward is to differentiate.
Yeah, but that is the other situation I talked about. So I mean, if you have an area with little integration so far, and you have some countries that would like to move ahead, but others would not, for all sorts of reasons. Ideological, they want to stick with neutrality, they have an Atlanticist perspective, and don't share the idea of European defense, or you have worries by some member states like France that others don't have the capacity to actually make an important contribution to a European defense. Here you start from basically no or very, very low level of integration, and differentiation helps. Yeah. Those countries that would like to move ahead to actually do that, yeah, and then others can stay out or maybe join later when they have the capacity or when they see it's working. This has been the very standard situation in which differentiated integration in the European Union has thrived. Yeah? And this is why I also think that in the area of defense, yeah, where you have this standard configuration, this is an extremely useful instrument. Just imagine maybe 50 years on, yeah, we have an integrated European defense sector and a European army, and we have a crisis in this area. Yeah, then it would be much harder to implement differentiated integration to solve these issues. Once you already move towards supranational integration, the costs of introducing differentiation ex post are usually too high and will not solve the issues for which the crisis erupt. So I think it's very important to keep these different starting points separate. But I mean, the good news for your project actually is that this is the situation in which in the past differentiation has really helped the European Union to move forward with contested integration projects. Oops.
Well, we have a few more. I think we take two at a time now to be able to have all. Yeah, first here.
Yes, thanks for this great presentation. And well, in what political areas do you find it most likely that we will see more differentiations in the following years? Do you think like the core of the European economic project with like free movement of labor, capital, goods and services will be a subject for more differentiation, or is it limited to the more peripheral areas of the EU project, such as, I don't know, you mentioned the EU army and also perhaps foreign policy and so on. It seems like, as an example, the EU delegation negotiating Brexit made it pretty clear to Theresa May that they were not dividing between, for example, services and goods, such as the British government wanted. Will this also be the case for member countries wanting to, I don't know, be a part of the freedom of movement, but not for certain areas?
I think we take one more if you can.
Yeah, okay.
Is that okay?
Sure.
Isn't the logical consequence of your analysis that there should be a stop in any further integration, whether it is differentiated or not? The reason for my question is it's about fixing the basic. And the basic may be on European level in some cases, as you pointed out, but also domestic situations in any country. So maybe the right thing is it's time to stop any further integration initiatives. Because if EU is not doing that, it will develop anyway in a differentiated situation in certain areas, and that may be the path toward disintegration of the whole EU.
Okay, thank you. So, to start with your question, as I said, I mean, defense is probably a very likely area in which you will see development in terms of differentiated integration, because it it combines the two prerequisites. It is very weakly integrated so far, and it's an area characterized by a lot of heterogeneity, both with regard to integration preferences and with regard to integration capacities. So I think this is a perfect field, yeah, for experimenting with differentiated integration. Whereas all those areas that are already highly integrated, already highly centralized, are unlikely to develop further in a differentiated way, especially if they are so far uniformly integrated. Now, the internal market is, of course, the basic example for high and uniform integration, and it is, as I also said, it is much easier for the EU to integrate in a differentiated way when it has not achieved high uniform integration yet. It is much more difficult to move from a uniform integration scheme to a differentiated one. And this is also why the EU has been so reluctant, yeah, to make any concessions in this area. Even when Cameron negotiated the new settlement, yeah, for the UK, the EU was extremely unwilling to make any major concessions on the four freedoms, yeah, which just some small things that they would allow him to do. So I mean, so again, I think it's this asymmetric situation, and I would not expect the EU to move away from that. I even think that during the Brexit negotiations, this dogma, yeah, that you can only have the four freedoms together or you will not have them, yeah, has even hardened. Even though we know that in practice it's not really the case, yeah, that you have clear distinctions in the integration of these four freedoms, yeah. But as a matter of principle, yeah, this has been strengthened during these negotiations. Another area where I see a lot of potential for differentiation is actually in the EU's external relations. So it's quite clear that EU enlargement has slowed down tremendously. Yeah, that on the one hand, there's no willingness of what I call the refuser countries to join the European Union anytime soon, but there's a lot of demand for cooperation with the European Union. Yeah, think of the Swiss case, think of the Norwegian case. There's a lot of scope for external differentiation, meaning cooperating below the level of membership. This is also true for those countries that I've called the refused countries, where the European Union wouldn't want them to join. But still, yeah, there's a lot of things to cooperate on with Turkey, with the Western Balkans, even for those countries that will, if ever, yeah, take a very long time to be able to join. So I think because again, this is an area of low-level integration, there's a lot of scope for differentiation. Yeah? So I think these. Think of those policy areas that are still integrated at a very low level in the European Union. Yeah? And defense, of course, is the core example. And think of areas of low integration with non-member states. Yeah? There you have basically the best prerequisites for experimenting with differentiated integration, but not in those areas that are already highly integrated. Now that brings me to your question, whether it wouldn't be even a better solution to stop with integration altogether. I think I agree with you when it comes to fixing the crisis issue. This should definitely have priority, and here differentiated integration will not be the answer. But here I think actually that what the European Union would need in all of these policy areas, the Euro refugees and so on, would actually be a further step of more integration to fix these issues. And the crises that the EU is in, I think, are not sufficient reason not to move ahead in those areas that I've just mentioned, which are at a very low level of integration so far, and which allow for more differentiated integration. So I think one has to look at this issue, policy by policy, and probably we will come to different answers depending on the policy that we talk about. I'm not sure it's all that helpful to say, well, we need to stop everything. I think we have to look at the policy issues one by one.
Okay, we have 5 minutes and four more questions. So I don't know if could we take all the questions and then
sure.
maybe you need something to.
In that case,
notes.
yes. Thank you.
Give you my notebook.
Okay.
And then I think Josef first, and then Christoph. Yeah.
Thanks for the framework, and I've enjoyed reading your work, and it obviously helps us to understand how the European Union can still keep going, even though there's so much friction and there's so many forces moving towards disintegration. But one thing that I was grappling with in your framework were the two logics of differentiation. One was instrumental differentiation, and the other one was constitutional differentiation, as you called it. Now, the instrumental differentiation obviously was something that was economically driven. The other one was about identity, but then you talked about wealth. Countries that were wealthy, that were more likely to want to be differentiated from the rest. Now, I wonder where in this framework would you fit countries that are not exactly rich and yet have a strong drive towards differentiation, such as Hungary, such as the Czech Republic, not wanting to join the Eurozone, such as even the UK, because the Brexit process probably isn't exactly economically driven. It's more of an identity thing. So where does it fit in?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, and then Christoph. Yeah, okay. You can pass it on.
Thank you very much for a nice presentation. I enjoyed it very much. I would indeed like you to speculate a little bit more about Brexit and the lessons that we can draw from Brexit with respect to differentiation. A couple of provocative points, perhaps. Is it possible to read Brexit as the limitation of differentiation, in the sense that first, with the UK leaving the European Union, you have the biggest beneficiary of opt-out and the biggest supporter of differentiation leaving the ship. Now, what does that mean in terms of the future of differentiation? Is it likely to be as easy for the remaining member states that are beneficiaries of differentiation to advocate their differentiated treatment within the realm of the application of EU law? Second, Brexit is also fundamentally about the recognition that a member state can leave the European Union if it feels uncomfortable with the European integration process. Now, does that in itself indicate a limitation to internal differentiation? That is to say, there is a point where if a member state wants more derogation, then probably the best path is Article 50. And at this point, I have to disagree with you with respect to your reading of Cameron's deal. I think had Cameron's the deal that Cameron cobbled together with the other member state in February 2016 entered into force, I think we would have that would have heralded a completely different kind of differentiation, which in my view would have led to disintegration rather than differentiation, particularly in a sense that for the first time, I think, in the history of the European integration process, it was possible to be a member state and not yet, and at the same time not be covered by the process of an ever closer union amongst the peoples of Europe. So basically what I'm interested in is ultimately, and you partly touched upon it, and I know you have only 2 minutes to answer, it's the whole issue of the limits of this differentiation. You talk about the functionality of this differentiation. How far can it go? And when we're finished, I will tell you something about accession treaties. There is one accession negotiation you did not perhaps think about, is the ongoing still accession negotiation with Turkey, which includes permanent derogations, which would again bring differentiation onto a completely different level.
Yeah.
Okay, you can pass it on to Karsten. You have two more. Karsten and then Øyvind, and then we have to
Thank
start.
you.
Maybe we will go 5 minutes over.
Those who need to leave can leave. My name is Karsten Friis. I work here at Nupian and I work on security and defense. So I would like to challenge perhaps the defense part of it, because there's something about the policy area of defense, which is, the main kind of sovereign right of a government to control its armed forces, and they basically tell when people can go the harm's way and you actually can kind of sacrifice your own people. There are arguments that saying that you will not have a European army until you have European government. In other words, integration, late in the day, I can't talk to anymore. Thank you very much. Will not work in the defense
Also say
sector.
DI.
Yes. Will not work in the defense sector because you should rather look for joint or harmonization cooperative solutions instead. And if you try to push this, you will simply not. You will maybe create a military unit, but will never be used because you can't agree when to use it. So you could actually backfire. Comment, please.
Final question.
Okay, Øyvind, University of Copenhagen and NUPI. I'll be quick. 2 questions. So one, I think there was a tension in something you said, I think. So what are the political consequences of the fact that rich countries get differentiation, poor countries don't get differentiation that much? They don't have the same leverage. At the same time, you say it's not a problem because the core central states are inclusive. But isn't the point with differentiation that they want exclusion? So that, And the second question, you talk about norms, that differentiation can't deal with norms, and this is an external question to your framework, but isn't differentiated integration a norm of European integration?
Okay, then we take 5 minutes and you can pick and choose.
Okay.
Yeah.
So first to Ulf and the identity and wealth issue. Well, I mean, what we find, it's basically an empirical finding, that in treaty revisions, both factors play a role, and for individual countries, the mix may be different. Let's say the overall logic is, there are countries that don't like the idea of too deep integration because of a strongly nationalist identity, but they can afford to have that position only or much better if they are also wealthy enough, so that they don't need deep integration. And this is, of course, the pattern that we found, especially with the northern countries. Now, what you allude to is a bit of an issue with our data set and how we code differentiation. So let's say the exemptions from Eurozone membership of Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic are coded as accession-based, because this is when it started. But of course, you're right. I mean, in the meantime, this is not about the Eurozone not wanting these countries. It's about these countries not wanting to join the Eurozone. So this is an issue, and it's actually 2 different things. Yeah, that's right. So the lessons from Brexit. What happens when the UK leave? Of course, there are people who say, well, the UK has really been the anchor of differentiated integration in the European Union. And when the UK leaves, let's say the largest supporter of a differentiated Europe, or one that goes against the idea of ever closer union, will not be there anymore, and smaller countries cannot hide behind the UK anymore. And what you will see is the Danes coming round and the Swedes coming round, maybe joining banking union, for instance, maybe even thinking about whether it makes sense not to have the euro. I mean, I think that's an open question. So far, what we found is that whereas on the part of the countries moving ahead, it is very important that they are a large group. For those that stay behind, want opt-outs, size has not been such a big issue in the past. But maybe this will change. I mean, I think it's an interesting open question for which I do not have an answer now. This remains to be seen. I fully agree with your reading of Cameron's deal. Had it happened, it would have been the first time that the principle of ever closer union would have been legally abrogated or legally limited in the European Union. So far, and that also goes back to your question, differentiated integration is not an EU norm. It's nowhere there. We have other norms like proportionality and what have you. Differentiation is not a norm. The norm is indeed ever closer union, but of course we've had a long-standing practice, which is not really questioned. I mean, even if Sweden has a legal obligation to join the euro, I mean, everybody in the eurozone accepts that unless the Swedes want it, they will not have it. So it's not really it's not really an acknowledged norm, but it's more of a long-standing practice. I mean, coming to the issue whether there are limits to differentiated integration, and whether the UK shows these limits. I mean, I think the evidence is quite mixed. I mean, there are some people that say, well, it's because of this precarious status that the UK has had in the European Union that it was easier, or it was clear that it would be more likely to leave at some point. But I mean, if you compare the UK to Denmark, you can tell a very different story. I mean, they have about the same level of differentiation in the European Union, and the Danes have been very happy with that. I mean, they are now one of the people in the European Union that are most satisfied with their membership, as long as it is differentiated. Yeah, so I think it can cut both ways. I mean, it can be a prelude, to actually leaving, but it can also stabilize the situation of a country in the European Union. And because we only have these two cases, it's very hard to tell, what is the dominant tendencies. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's okay. We are over time, and thank you so much for coming and for a very good presentation, and thank you for the questions and answers.
Yeah, thank you all for
definitely continue with this topic, more in the area of foreign and security policy, so we will come back to this discussion. But thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.